Some Marvel characters look so much like DC characters. It's hard to believe it's just a coincidence. Some of their powers are so unbelievably similar. Fans have argued for decades over who copied whom, and by the end of this video, you might not agree with every comparison, but some of them are almost impossible to ignore.
You're on fire!
Thanks, you're pretty good too!
No, you're on fire!
Human Torch and Pyro. Fire feels like one of the oldest superpowers in comic book history. If you can control fire, how different can that power really be? As it turns out, completely different. Johnny Storm doesn't just manipulate flames, he becomes them. His entire body ignites, allowing him to generate fire powerful enough to melt steel while flying through the sky like a living comet. Pyro looks just as dangerous. But there's one problem. He can't create a single flame. His mutant ability only allows him to control fire that already exists. Without someone else lighting the first spark, Pyro has nothing to manipulate. Ironically, that's exactly what makes him so dangerous. Instead of relying on raw power, he bends existing flames into dragons, shields, weapons, and walls of fire with incredible precision. One creates fire, the other commands it. Visually, they almost look like the same character. Mechanically, they couldn't be more different, and as impressive as fire already is, both publishers would eventually imagine something so much larger that an entire planet would become a living character. That sounds impossible. We'll come back to that a little later.
Do you know what happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning?
Thor and Storm. If fire dominates the battlefield, the weather controls the entire war. At first glance, Thor and Storm almost feel interchangeable. Lightning, thunder, hurricanes, storms capable of devastating entire armies. But that's where the similarities begin, and almost immediately end. Thor commands the storm because of who he is. The god of thunder has always been tied to lightning, whether through Mjolnir or his own divine power. Storm's abilities work very differently. She isn't summoning lightning. She's manipulating the atmosphere itself. Temperature, humidity, air pressure, wind currents, cloud formation. Lightning is simply one consequence of everything else she's controlling. That's why Storm can end droughts, redirect hurricanes, and create blizzards just as easily as she calls down lightning. Thor unleashes the storm. Storm becomes the storm. It's one of the clearest examples of Marvel and DC arriving at nearly the same visual idea while building two completely different explanations around it. But weather isn't the only force both publishers transformed into a weapon. Years later, they stumbled onto another idea that sounds almost ridiculous on paper. What if someone's voice became more dangerous than any superpower? We'll get there. First, let's look at the people who actually proved that idea could work. Black Bolt, Black Canary, and Banshee. Controlling fire is terrifying. Controlling the weather is even worse. But Marvel and DC eventually discovered that one of the deadliest weapons imaginable didn't require either of them. It only required a voice. Black Bolt is forced to live in almost complete silence. Not because he chooses to, because even the slightest whisper can unleash a shockwave powerful enough to level buildings. A normal conversation isn't just dangerous, it can become a catastrophe. DC approached the same idea from a different angle. Black Canary channels her canary cry into focused sonic blasts, capable of shattering steel, knocking back opponents, and overwhelming enemies far stronger than herself. Then there's Banshee. Rather than relying on overwhelming destruction alone, Sean Cassidy uses sound with remarkable precision. His sonic scream lets him fly, disorient opponents, generate powerful shockwaves, and even navigate through echolocation. Three completely different characters. Three completely different origins, yet all of them arrived at the same terrifying conclusion. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't something you hold in your hand. It's something you've had since the day you were born. Ironically, none of these characters are the biggest surprise in this video, because later we'll meet two people who became terrifying without possessing a single superpower, and even they won't be the strangest comparison. At one point, both Marvel and DC asked themselves an almost absurd question. What if an entire planet could think? We'll come back to that.
Maggot piece of shit that I put down, I did it because I liked it. Hell, I loved it.
Punisher and Wild Dog. By now, we've looked at abilities that can level cities. Fire, storms, sonic screams. But here's something neither Marvel nor DC expected. Sometimes, superpowers aren't necessary at all. Frank Castle and Jack Wheeler became legendary for exactly the same reason. Neither one can fly. Neither one possesses super strength. Neither one heals faster than a normal human. If you stripped away their weapons, they'd simply be two exceptionally well-trained men, which makes what they accomplish even more impressive. Both served in the military. Both became disillusioned with the system that was supposed to deliver justice, and both eventually decided that waiting for criminals to face consequences wasn't enough anymore. So they declared war themselves. The Punisher fights an endless one-man war against organized crime after the murder of his family. Wild Dog follows a remarkably similar philosophy, taking on terrorists, extremists, and violent criminals with military tactics and overwhelming firepower. They're not superheroes in the traditional sense. They're soldiers who never stopped fighting. It's one of the clearest examples of Marvel and DC independently arriving at almost the exact same anti-hero. But here's what's interesting. The next comparison isn't about the people hunting criminals, it's about the people running them. And unlike Frank Castle or Wild Dog, these men don't need weapons. They've already convinced an entire city to fight for them.
What a little bitch.
Kingpin and Penguin, Frank Castle and Wild Dog hunt the people who built criminal empires. Marvel and DC eventually asked a different question. What happens when the criminal empire becomes more dangerous than any superpower? Wilson Fisk and Oswald Cobblepot answered it almost the same way. Neither one can fly. Neither one can shoot lasers. Neither one can level a city with a single punch. And yet, both have brought entire cities to their knees. Kingpin rules New York through fear, corruption, and an empire so deeply rooted that taking down one operation usually creates two more. Every politician, every police officer, and every gang leader could become another piece on his chessboard. The Penguin built Gotham differently. His iceberg lounge looks like nothing more than an upscale nightclub. In reality, it's one of Gotham's largest information hubs, where criminals, politicians, and corrupt businessmen constantly cross paths. Oswald doesn't need to rob banks anymore. People come to him. That's what makes both characters so fascinating. They don't control cities with superpowers, they control people. Money, secrets, fear, and sometimes those are far more dangerous than any mutation. But eventually, Marvel and DC stopped creating villains who manipulated the world around them. Instead, they imagined villains who could literally become anything they wanted. We'll get there in just a moment. Before that, remember those living planets I mentioned earlier? As ridiculous as that idea sounds, they still aren't the strangest beings either publisher has ever created. Sandman and Clayface. If Kingpin and Penguin prove that power doesn't require superpowers, Sandman and Clayface prove something even stranger. Sometimes, the most dangerous body is the one that no longer behaves like a body at all. Flint Marko became Sandman after his molecular structure fused with radioactive sand, allowing him to reshape himself almost without limits. Giant hammers, towering walls, spinning blades, entire sandstorms capable of swallowing battlefields. Breaking his bones doesn't matter anymore, because he doesn't really have bones. DC explored almost the exact same concept with Clayface. Basil Karlo's body transformed into living clay, giving him the ability to stretch, reshape himself, impersonate other people, and recover from damage that would kill almost anyone else. It's one of the closest power comparisons Marvel and DC have ever produced. Different materials, the exact same terrifying concept, a body that refuses to stay human. Ironically, even these characters eventually started looking small, because both publishers kept asking the same question. How much stronger can we possibly make one character? The answer wasn't another hero. It wasn't another villain. It was something far closer to a natural disaster. And unlike Sandman or Clayface, these monsters become even more dangerous every time you think you've beaten them.
Holy shit, he got my missile!
Hulk Doomsday, and Solomon Grundy. Every superhero universe eventually reaches the same problem. If your strongest character can already lift mountains, how do you make the next one feel even more unstoppable? Marvel answered that question with the Hulk. The angrier Bruce Banner becomes, the stronger he gets. There isn't a switch that turns the power off. No clearly defined ceiling. Every hit, every loss, every reason to keep fighting only makes him more dangerous. DC took that same idea and pushed it in two different directions. First came Solomon Grundy, a cursed monster who refuses to stay dead. Defeat him today, and sooner or later, he'll crawl out of the grave again. Every resurrection changes him slightly, but one thing never changes. He always comes back. Then there's Doomsday. Unlike Grundy, Doomsday doesn't just survive death, he learns from it. Every time he's killed, his body evolves, making the exact same method useless the next time. It's the reason he achieved something almost no villain in comic book history ever has. He killed Superman, 3 characters, 3 completely different origins, yet all 3 were built around exactly the same terrifying idea. What if strength wasn't the real power? What if refusing to stay down was, and somehow, even creatures like these weren't the biggest escalation Marvel and DC could imagine? Remember those living planets we mentioned earlier? It's finally time to explain them. Ego and Mogo. At some point, creating stronger heroes simply wasn't enough anymore. Marvel and DC both arrived at the same impossible question. What if an entire planet was alive? Marvel answered first with Ego. Created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, Ego isn't a planet that's home to life. He is the life. Every mountain, every ocean, every continent is part of one enormous conscious being. Ego can reshape his own surface, create gigantic humanoid avatars, and unleash cosmic attacks powerful enough to challenge some of Marvel's strongest heroes. Years later, DC introduced Mogo, another living planet, but one that couldn't be more different. Instead of threatening the universe, Mogo protects it. As one of the most respected members of the Green Lantern Corps, he guides power rings toward worthy lanterns across the galaxy while using his entire planetary body as a weapon when necessary. One living planet became a villain, the other became a hero. 2 publishers, the exact same unbelievable concept, completely different personalities. And yet, even living planets eventually stopped being the ceiling, because once you've created heroes, villains, monsters, and entire worlds that can think, there's really only one question left to answer: who created all of them? The one above all and the presence. By now, both Marvel and DC had imagined almost everything. Heroes who controlled fire, gods who commanded storms, voices capable of destroying cities, bodies that could reshape themselves, monsters that refused to die, even planets that were alive. At that point, there was only one place left to go. Not stronger heroes, not bigger villains, something above all of them. Marvel answered that question with the one above all, the supreme creator of the entire Marvel multiverse. Unlike cosmic beings such as Eternity, Infinity, Galactus, or even the Living Tribunal, the one above all doesn't exist within the hierarchy. He exists above it. Every law of reality, every universe, every cosmic entity ultimately traces back to him. DC eventually arrived at almost the exact same destination: the presence, the creator of the DC multiverse, the source of existence itself. Angels, cosmic entities, and even beings powerful enough to reshape reality all ultimately exist because of him. What's fascinating isn't that both publishers created an all-powerful god. That was almost inevitable. What's fascinating is how similar the idea became. Once both universes had reached the absolute limit of their own power scales, they both arrived at the exact same conclusion. If someone has to stand above everyone else, that being can only be the creator himself. And maybe that's the most interesting comparison in this entire video, because it brings us back to the question we started with. Did Marvel copy DC, or did DC copy Marvel? The truth is, we'll probably never know. But after comparing fire manipulators, living weapons, crime lords, living planets, and even the gods who created their universes, one thing becomes very difficult to ignore. Sometimes, the greatest similarities between Marvel and DC weren't the characters, they were the ideas.